welcome to episode 11 of the Out of the Game podcast. We are down to what Sean Elliott referred to as a skeleton crew. But the good news is that means that Sean Elliott is indeed on this call. Sean, how are you doing today?
Hello? How's that?
And our resident D'Artagnan, our international man of mystery, resurfaced from the dead, kind of like Master Chief falling from space, unsure whether or not he's going to survive. But yes, he does live. Luke Smith.
Oh, hello, fellas.
Luke, you could do better than that. That was the most, between you and I, that was the most awkward intro ever. Luke, we gotta come with some heat next time.
I don't do like the whole like weird voices thing. That's like your thing. Mine is like, apathy and, I just woke up.
The weird voice thing there for me was just a matter of like, I'm coming in like a bozo. We need to come in with heat, and that was bad.
Anyway,
No.
maybe that just means
I
we're
want to come
setting
in bad. I think that's a good bar to set. Like, it can only get a little bit better from here. Like, let's do that.
Well, speaking of things that can only get better from here, the anticipation for James Cameron's Avatar started out really high. People super excited, and people who saw it at Comic-Con, I believe, were super excited. But this was going to be the first test in front of a larger audience. They had the special IMAX showings of, I believe, 15, 16 minutes of footage from the movie, and the overwhelming internet consensus seems to be that the footage was not game-changing, as my fellow Canadian James Cameron promised, but people were throwing out things like Fern Gully as comparisons and saying that the CG was very prominent and noticeable. They were ridiculing the blue creatures. What did you guys make of it? Anyone see it?
Yeah, we watched the trailer.
So you saw the trailer on iTunes?
That's somewhere. I think I saw it from a French site that had uploaded it and put it together with some French subtitles or something. And I think I'm sure other people have said it, but just like the offhand remark is like it's Halo meets World of Warcraft, which should be pretty much the most successful thing ever if that were actually the case. But people are just responding to the aesthetic of the blue creatures, which also share some similarities with furries. And then, the more or less futuristic Marines with dropships and powerful weaponry and stuff.
I think it's funny that...
Well, I would have gone further back, and I would have said, wasn't there that launch title for the original Xbox called Azuric that had a blue-skinned hero?
I don't remember that. There's a lot of blue skins, though. You got the whole Mystique and Nightcrawler from the Marvel Universe. You got,
absolutely. You've got Mass Effect.
Let's not forget about the
famed blue
Smurfs.
alien. Yes, Smurfette. Who doesn't love Smurfette?
So we got
but Luke, since Halo was thrown into the mix as a point of comparison, I mean, what was your take? Because I'll say from my perspective, I definitely felt that. Well, I didn't go to see IMAX theater, so I didn't get to see the full-on impact of what the footage is really going to look like, especially in 3D. And there is a school of people who say, hey, if you're not seeing it in 3D, you're not really getting the full impact of it. But from some of the shots he showed, I definitely felt like James Cameron, if there ever is a Halo movie, would be better suited to it than Neil Blomkamp, who directed District 9, because I've always felt that the Halo shorts that he did was sort of like the very bleached out, almost monochromatic look, was more suited to, say, the Gears universe than it was to Halo, which is very colorful. And I felt like the James Cameron stuff from Avatar, particularly the stuff when the hero is coming off the ship on his wheelchair and things like that, there were things that, it's not so much that it looked like Halo, but maybe it was just the fact that there was color and it was sci-fi. I was like, get that, man.
People talking about how it looks like Halo is really interesting, and I think a little bit probably flattering for the Bungie team, because a lot of Halo is so inspired by Alien and Aliens, and it's this weird sort of full circle, I guess, to me. Recently those things, some of those like flying planes certainly do look like Hornets, but I mean Hornets probably were inspired by something else. I don't know what the artistic reference is. I saw both the trailer on the internet, and then a couple of buddies from work and I went and checked out the 16-minute 3D IMAX presentation. And I thought that compared to, like, it was basically the extended version of scenes from the trailer that showed that morning. And I don't think the CG is, like, the CG doesn't bother me. I guess I'm not like the most critical eye of like how real or bad does this look, or like is this taking me out of this like real world and now it's all fantasy land. Like I thought it looked pretty decent. My biggest concern is going to be like if the story is really going to be told about a bunch of blue, tall, skinny aliens. Like, I think that a lot of people are just going to have a fundamental problem caring about the aliens. And, like, it seems like Cameron's taking such stock in, like, I'm going to make you care about this man, this handicapped man who's gone to a hellish planet and become an alien, and he's supposed to infiltrate them, but instead he learns about their people and even falls in love with one of them and then saves them.
That storyline is basically... That storyline's basically like there's a million versions of it, right? Dances with Wolves, The Last Samurai, and it's such a. I mean, I forget what. In the same way that it compared it to Halo rather than Aliens, or to Starship Troopers, or any number of other things with Space Marines and stuff. I think we use the most relevant, culturally relevant at the moment. And so you're right. That is a huge compliment to Halo because it means that now when you think of Space Marines in any kind of setting like that. You say Halo because you expect that to be the most familiar thing for people, or the most, relevant at the moment. Yeah, the story, I kind of want to see what they do with that,
Well, it's very, I guess what it seems is somewhat uncomplicated. I mean, I've read the scriptment from when it was posted online, and it seemed like the Na'vi, which is the race of tall blue skin creatures, they're at one with the environment, and
they use all of the buffalo.
Exactly. I mean, in some ways, this seems like the kind of movie that Kevin Costner might have made in his messianic phase, the Postman and stuff, like where, I don't know if you guys remember seeing that, but just the idea that, he was the one man with untainted sperm, and, so in some ways, I guess it was his duty to share it with women who were trying to reproduce. I was just like, wow, Kevin, really? That's a long way from The Untouchables.
I missed that one.
You weren't missing much. But anyway, the idea, they can sort of, I believe, the giant flying creatures, they can sort of mind meld with them, and that's how they control their mounts and all these other things. And I don't know, I feel like the moment we're in, people might be ready for something a little more complicated, right? So the idea that humans are bad and Na'vi are good, and I guess there are some good humans, and presumably there'll be some Na'vi that don't necessarily accept him right away. He has to, learn the ways of the Na'vi and stuff like that. I have those concerns as well. Not so much as Luke. I think that Cameron writes in like pretty good.
Sorry, I was just going to say, this is all Rousseau. This is like, when I was talking about forgetting what some of the really older versions of, and this is just another version of Rousseau's sort of wide-eyed and naive naturalism and take on, and then it resurfaced over and over again. Margaret Mead, for example, in her fraudulent anthropological work.
Yeah, and I think when you look at some of the things that Cameron has done at his best, if you look at Aliens, the original writer of the original movie and director Ridley Scott, they set up this idea of almost like these truckers, like union workers in space. And, there's that really great moment where you've got Yaphet Kotto and I forget the other actor's name, and they're in a hallway and they're being asked how long it's going to take to repair something, and they're sort of, Yaphet Kotto pulls out some tubes to make it look worse than it is and sound worse than it is. So you have these portrayals of people that are a little more complicated. It's not all good or all bad. I'm not going to pretend it's like the deepest, most earth-shattering, insightful portrayals of human nature, but it is complicated. And in Aliens, the sequel, you had you had Paul Reiser as the embodiment of the corporation, and his betrayal, and you have the Space Marines, and sort of their militaristic take, and you have Ripley once again rising to the fore with her sort of maternal instinct. I don't believe they left it in the original cut, but in the director's cut, there's a bit of a scene about how the daughter that she had has since passed away because of how many years she was floating in space. So those kinds of things. And if you think of Terminator 2, when you have John Connor teaching the Terminator, the cyborg, this killing machine, to be more human, to respect human life, and you have Lyndall Hamilton playing Sarah Connor, who is becoming more and more machine-like in order to better protect her ton and save him. The moment where she recognizes that he's come to the hospital to save her, and she's like, basically, why the hell did you do that? I told you, I warned you, you're more important than me. And then it all culminates in the scene where she, leads the one-woman assault on Miles Dyson's place, and her movements, her vibe is very Terminator-like. To me, that's James Cameron, the writer, at his strongest and at his best. And my concern is that you may not have those moments in this movie.
Yeah,
because when I think back to Titanic, I don't remember it being very complicated.
Did Cameron do the original Terminator?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I was going to say, like, if not, I would say he's great at doing sequels and coming in on other people's work, at least as evinced by what he did with Aliens. But I mean, I guess his own work too in Terminator, because I mean, of course, everything you're speaking to, the brilliance of that movie is that inversion. And instead of saying, well, let's just have, of course, they do have a bigger, badder Terminator, but the twist, being that the relentless juggernaut in the first one is now the ultimate father figure. But yeah, I mean, even I don't know. I would be surprised if a movie that's been in production for so very long is, I don't know. I mean, I honestly, I'm just guessing. I haven't been following it or anything, and I would just hope that there's something there to it other than just another version of, like I said, The Last Samurai or something.
Yeah, I hope so too. I mean, it's just hard to tell. I mean, James Cameron's a very, he deals in, archetypes and types like a lot of commercial filmmakers, and when he's on, that stuff can really stick. I mean, even True Lies, which he wrote the script on, the parts that I found the most entertaining, apart from the action sequences, he's terrific at directing action, was the whole sort of middle part where he's he thinks his wife is cheating on him, and he's, using all of his, spy abilities to track her and find out what's really going on, again, culminating in the moment where he's interrogating her, which is, I think Cameron meant it to be twisted, but it came across, at least to me, even more twisted than what he was actually portraying on screen. And Strange Days, which he I don't believe he's not credited with the entire script as finished. I believe it was, Jay Cox, who wrote Age of Innocence, who came in and wrote that, but he wrote the scriptment that it was based on. He wrote that for Catherine Bigelow, his ex-wife, and there's some creepy, twisted, stuff in there. So, hopefully it won't be as simple as it's coming across. And, reading a scriptment is very different from seeing something that's being embodied by actors. He's got a terrific cast. I mean, I don't think Sam Worthington showed a ton of what he could do in this summer's Terminator Salvation, but I think he's got a lot of potential. You've got Sigourney Weaver back, and an actor that I didn't really know anything about until I saw him in Public Enemies. This actor named Stephen Lang, who plays one of the members of Purvis's FBI team that's trying to take down Johnny Depp. In that movie, he plays, it sounds like a general or head of the military, and you see him in the trail with the scars across the face, and he's a fabulous actor. So I'm hoping we'll see some great stuff there.
Indeed.
Okay.
So
that's a lot on Cameron and Avatar for something that we only hope is going to be sweet. This episode, kids.
Well, Luke, what was the reaction of the people in the theater who saw it with you?
It was actually just sort of like it was quiet. Everyone was dead silent when it was going on, and then when it was over, there was that sort of like, like limp, like slow applause, like. I mean,
clap.
If you logged into the internet to get a ticket, like you logged in to some website and sign yourself up for a ticket, and God knows what else they're gonna send you. Like Cameron's gonna be preaching to his base there, I think. Like,
of course,
it's mostly gonna be people who are like, I'm totally willing to go do this on a Friday night rather than any other number of things that are guaranteed. They're gonna be sweet.
How was it presented,
golfing.
Luke? Like they just had a theater, and you go to see a 16-minute clip, and
yeah. So like there was a line at the box office. The theater that I went to is always fucking terribly busy on the weekends, and my buddy and I just walked up to the movie counter, like showed him the Gmail receipt or whatever, and they like passed you off like further into the theater to some podium where there were like three presumably like Fox satellite marketing girls. And they're like, "Oh, are you here for Avatar?" Like, yep. And then I'm like, "How full is it?" And she's like, "Oh, it's like half full. It's not nearly as full as we expected it to be." And I think that was probably a trend throughout.
How did you get the Gmail
screenings.
tickets? I mean, were they available to everyone, or are they trying to hit early adopters and influential people? I don't...
No. It was like they announced at Comic-Con that there was going to be Avatar Day, and then a guy from work who's really excited about the movie has been watching the website, and it was just like open registration, pick your theater, and you're like, where do you live, and here's the list of theaters doing it in your area, and then you pick your theater and enter your information, take that, show your ID, and then bam, that's it.
I was just curious, like in the PR. I mean, they're obviously being pretty aggressive with the PR on it and trying to make it into a big event, and I didn't know if that was just because. I mean, because the movies I think that made the director as successful as he is aren't necessarily the kind that speak to the audience that you think is going to, react the most strongly to this movie. And so I don't know. I'm just kind of wondering. It just seems like they're manufacturing buzz, or I've just been out of it and I didn't notice it, and all of a sudden now it's in my face.
But also, I mean, all the trailers and tags and all whatever the fuck it's called say like from the director of Titanic, like. There's going to be, I mean, that's not from the director of Aliens or whatever. Like, they want you and your lady friends to be, your lady friends to be like, oh, God, Titanic was awesome. We should totally go see this love story about blue people. Which, like, the guys are going to be like, okay, I was going to go see this with the dudes. And then I think that people might be upset.
It's funny. They tried to do that, though. I remember, like, after Terminator 2 had been out for, like, a month, and all of a sudden, remember the ads were, like, a heartfelt movie. Like, it was as though it were, like, an ad for Avalon or fried green tomatoes or something, but meanwhile, there's a total disconnect on the screen. Like, fucking shit's blowing up, and Metal Man's losing half his face, and dude was playing it up like...
But Luke,
or something.
for single guys like ourselves, I mean, assuming you're still single, actually, I mean, this is great because it's like now, you take her to go see Avatar, bring her back to your place, throw on Welcome to Shanghai. I mean, in like Flynn.
I'm gonna be using Avatar as my winter date movie. I think it's from that. Did you see Titanic? Yeah, no, it's by that guy. It's his first movie in like 15 years. It's gonna be awesome. Really, really sensitive movie. We should totally check it out. Oh, that sounds great. Have you seen Terminator 2? It's a family story. It's like Home Alone with robots.
Dude, Luke, people comment on the responses to the podcast that how much you've changed, and I think it's so because this whole time I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, when is he going to talk about having the bucket of popcorn with the hole in the bottom over his dick during the screening? And it just doesn't come anymore, man. Like,
yeah,
you've matured.
I don't know what it is. It's just I'm growing up. I'm getting old. I'm still awful. I just try to be nicer, publicly.
Yeah, I still like to talk about that. Like when I worked in the movie theater, there would be the ushers who would clean the theater afterwards would now and then find these like avocados that were just totally mangled up, and it wasn't that people were making guacamole. Well, they were inadvertently making guacamole, but they were humping them.
Luke, one more thing before we.
They're humping avocados while they watch movies.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it wasn't even like a Pee Wee Herman theater or anything either. Like who knows? They could have been watching anything. Okay, so let's get
reaction to the avocado.
Do you want to talk?
Yes, let's get back on track
about Shadow Complex, since we're talking about. I don't know how I can compare Orson Scott Card to. I mean, since we're talking about science fiction, and here we have a science fiction game with a noted science fiction author who, as far as I understand, created the universe but not the story or the characters or the events depicted in the game.
Yeah, there's been. I don't know. I've seen it described a lot of different ways. From what I understand, is that the Mustard Brothers, who were they created the game. Oh gosh, I'm just completely spacing on it now. Not Shadow Complex. That's their new game. What was the game the first
Rising?
game they were known for? Advent Rising.
Yeah.
I was like, there was the ADV and Avatar. I was getting confused. Anyway, so they created Advent Rising, and then they did Undertow, which was an Xbox Live Arcade game. The original Advent Rising was on Xbox. And now working on this, and they've worked with Orson Scott Card before. I think they've known him for some time, and he did the story for Advent Rising. I mean, I believe that the Mustards came up with the concept and like probably the overall plot, but like specific dialogue and stuff, I believe Orson Scott Card worked on, and then he worked on Shadow Complex. And there's also novels that are set in this universe called Empire, and I believe Empire was a console game that they wanted to do, and then they decided to introduce it through this Xbox Live Arcade game, Shadow Complex. And Orson Scott Card wrote the novels, but I believe the universe that it's set on, which is future Earth, I guess not super distant future, they created that together, and then he went off and wrote the novels and did some work along with a comic book writer named Peter David on the game, but Orson Scott Card alone, I believe, wrote the novels.
That makes sense,
or novel.
Despite all of the, of course, by talking about Card, we're moving into the controversy about Card's political views and how some people have talked about whether or not they should boycott the game because of them. But all that aside, I mean, even having his name attached, I played maybe about 3 hours or something, and all I can see is that it's basically a couple's out for a hike in the woods, and all signs point to them both being NSA agents, and they just happen upon what's essentially Cobra, as in G.I. Joe's antagonist, Cobra's $100 billion subterranean headquarters in Washington State that neither the IRS nor any branch of the government was able to detect developing there. And so it's like, I don't know, it didn't seem like the kind of thing that takes someone to write it so much as, and then that's not to knock the game, because I think the game so far is just, it's incredible fun. But you know how it goes. I mean, it would be like if you said that, I don't know, like Arthur C. Clarke was involved in writing the original Metroid story or something. You'd say, like, well,
right.
What, that took someone to do that,
Right, but I mean, obviously the games that you're working on are probably more narrative heavy, but I mean, based on the games that you worked on or been around and sort of seen, I mean, do you take that to mean that game developers who are making those kinds of games shouldn't engage a writer or even a comic book writer, that this is something that the programmer can do in his Mountain Dew fueled off hours? Or
exactly.
Is there a role for writers to play in those games?
I mean to clarify, especially for new listeners that aren't familiar with my perspective, is that I don't think story is in any way, shape, or form necessary for a game. I think there's a ton of potential for what it can contribute to certain games. But so there's nothing about the game screams that it needs a story, but it's just because it's so loose. It's essentially a scenario. It's a place, a villain, and a hero. That reminds me of the time when you would have like Carmack and Romero making a game, and you really didn't need to go hunting around through Hollywood for someone to help you get the most out of your demons versus Space Marine scenario. because ultimately you're just not going to do that much with it. It's just the fictional veneer that you need to explain some things, or the ability to teleport, or whatever the case is. And like, yeah, I'll keep playing and we'll see what happens. But so far, I'm just kind of wondering. It's like, it just seems bizarre, that it.
But the flip side is something like Left 4 Dead, which is also a scenario, but is very written, and I think very well written and cleverly written. Now, they're very specific about how and where the writing enters the game. There's not a massive plot-based setup. I believe the first words you see on screen after the title of the game in the original is 2 weeks after the infection. But the writing on the wall, the graffiti and all of those things, it seems to me a lot of care and attention and talent went into that. So it seems even when you have a scenario, there's room for a writer and room for good or great writers. So maybe what you're reacting to in Shadow Complex is not the fact that a writer was needed, but maybe you're reacting to actually the quality of the writing.
It could be. Well, I'm not so much reacting to the quality of the writing as the scenario and the plot there, right? I mean, the writing is available. There are several times when you're playing the game where it's kind of like in Metal Gear Solid, where you're going through vents or something and you have a view of people below you and you're able to overhear their snippets of their conversation. And it creates all these opportunities to provide backstory about the context that you're in. But it's just the context itself, though, that this is a facility that's basically the perfect kind. I mean, if you're going to create this sort of, Metroidvania style map, this is exactly the kind of situation you want. It neatly allows you to go above ground into some like really pretty northwestern evergreen forest and stuff, and then back down into the complex. There's a lot of steel and girders and such. But yeah, I don't want to make too much of it. I'm not really saying much other than that. Basically, if they pulled the universe from someone else, and the universe is basically that there's some nefarious bad guys in an underground complex, it's like, is that really worth the royalties? Is what I'm asking. I mean, that's almost like public property. It's like zombies. It's the same thing. It's no different. It's like, there's a zombie infection and here come zombies. It's all about what you do with it afterward.
Right. I mean, obviously inspiration can come from a number of places, but I mean, part of the reason I'm sort of being very, specific or a little provocative or contentious on this point is, again, let's take a look at another Valve game in Portal, right? I mean, at best, the name of your character. I think you may find that out at some point later, but you wake up in an underground facility. You have this gun that can create portals on walls and other surfaces, and you need to get out. That, again, doesn't seem like a plot or a premise or a scenario that would require much writing. But I don't think that it would have been received nearly as well if it wasn't for the writing. So, I mean, I understand where you're coming from in the school of thought, which, you referenced id, and I believe that John Carmack famously said that plot in games or storytelling in games is like storytelling in a porn movie. Sure, it's nice if it's there, but who really cares? Does it really matter?
No, I think we're in total agreement. The difference is because I'm not talking about David's contributions, which would be the things in. So this would be the difference, right? If you have Eric Wolpaw, who is taking for Portal and coming up with GLaDOS' personality, the turret situations, any of the other instances when you're playing the game where you find something out about the world, versus if they had paid some third party for just the general idea that there's this complex called Aperture Science, and it's got a bunch of big rooms in it with stuff that can kill you. Right. So, I'm just, that's all I'm questioning is just the loosest thing. It's like, well, maybe they could have just had Wolpaw come up with that instead of paying whoever they did. And they didn't, of course. This is
right. And hopefully from what I understand, and again, I could be wrong, I think that Chair actually is the originator of the IP. And then I don't know if they licensed it to Orson Scott Card and to do the novels based on this thing, or was it co-created? But I believe that Chair itself has some sort of interest and ownership in the IP. So they participated in it in some way. But I mean, you know, well, what did you think of the game? I mean,
the game itself, it seems like it strikes me as the perfect place for them to be in, because of course they had these grand ambitious plans for Advent Rising to be this trilogy, and it didn't work out. They had the win $1 million promotion to go with the original game, and then they ultimately weren't able to award people with that prize, and they just got in way over their heads. And you could see that they had a number of excellent ideas, but they might not necessarily have had either the funding or the studio infrastructure to realize their vision to the level of quality that they wanted. And here, by presenting everything that was a weakness before, it works as a strength now, because by presenting their game as this Xbox Live thing, and it, you know, vastly reduced price, but yet of course the game is of the quality that you could easily charge full price for it. And you come in, and so maybe even if it were a first person game and it cost $60, for example, and had the usual marketing rollout, and you played it, we would be hearing the opposite about the graphics. People would be talking about how low res a lot of the meshes are and stuff, and instead every one of those, you look at it and you're like, God, this is such a beautiful game, because instead you're comparing it to, you know, other games for about the same price that you purchased, and then ultimately the games it's inspired by, like Metroid and Castlevania, and it looks gorgeous, right? And then they're able to, by making it 2D, they're able to avoid all sorts of, you know, problems that you run into with AI and with bugs, with physics and stuff, and they really just focus on the game that they want to make there. And there's tons of perfect textbooks for them out there, so to speak, to learn from, you know, all the games in the 2D series from Japan that I mentioned. And then they bring, of course, their own stuff to it too. Like, I want to see what you guys think of the granularity of the progression, you know, insofar as you're gaining new skills and abilities for your character and ranking up and stuff. I mean, all that seems just really perfectly paced, and there's such an enormous variety of upgrades and things.
I haven't played it yet, so this is actually really interesting. How much of that stuff is driven by you? Like, what level of depth are you building your, like, shadow complex character in the game? Like, what is that like?
I'm going to ask N-Guy to help me out here, because since I've just gotten into it, I haven't. All of the stuff that I've been collecting so far has been automatic insofar as you pick something up or you perform, you know, well enough for a certain amount of time or some other non-transparent condition, and you receive the upgrade. A lot of it's been optional, though, insofar as that you look around the map and you see, hey, here's a tunnel here, or I can backtrack here. I now have the means to open this door and go into this whole other area, or I'd rather just go forward, you know, like I'm going to go with the urgency of the story and try to rescue this woman. And so you have all that choice there. As for when you go into the character sheet and start to choose the type of character you want to be, I'm not certain that that's there. Maybe you can confirm or deny that for me, N-Guy.
I haven't gotten probably much further than you have in the game, so I'm not aware of that. But it was like you were saying from the stuff I experienced, which is that, you know, you gain power ups that give you the ability to have more health and carry more grenades and things like that, and then you get specific weapon upgrades that become so you have, you know, more powerful weapons as you go through the game. One of the things that I felt, and I'm a big fan of, I came to Metroid late, just like I came to gaming late. So the ones that I'm familiar with and love are Metroid Fusion and Metroid Zero Mission, which was a remake of the original Metroid. Both those games were on the Game Boy Advance, and I really love both those games, played them through to completion. And one of the things that they kept were save rooms. And I felt like that was actually something that they could have gotten rid of for a couple of reasons. One, I don't know if it was just that it was the fact that it was an Unreal Engine game, the fact that it was, you know, 3D graphics as opposed to sprites, but I felt like it would have been better to have checkpoint saves than save rooms, partially because the save rooms weren't uniform in appearance the way they were in the original in Metroid Fusion and Metroid Zero Mission. So sometimes if you weren't looking at the map and seeing the star icon that indicate that there were save rooms, you wouldn't necessarily know that there were save rooms. So I just kind of felt like that was an anachronism that they had preserved. And the other thing I liked better about the way Metroid did save rooms is that you would get your health boosted back up and your weapon, your ammo refilled and things like that whenever you saved. In this game, if I'm not mistaken, I don't believe it does that. It just saves you at that point.
Really, I
it was one of those things
messed
like
with
where
that enough to know, but I'm curious if how that could be the case, because how do they prevent a death spiral then, right? Like if it's auto saving when you go into this area and they're not provisioning you, how do they prevent you from basically getting in a save state with 2 health and 1 grenade?
Well, that leads to another issue, and when I'm raising these things, I mean, the stuff I played in the game, I very much enjoyed. So I'm not saying I didn't like the game. I did, but another thing. So I believe in the save rooms there are health packs and ammo packs that you can pick up. So
right, and they probably respawn those too, based on.
Exactly.
I'm guessing they have some neat way to respawn them either over time or over proximity, so that you can't constantly run back in, run out the door, do some attrition damage on an enemy and come back in. But when you're talking about the save point, the one thing that you gain with those is that when it's entirely up to the player to determine whether or not they save. In a game like that, when you decide, I'm going to go, I don't know how big and non-linear this is, but in some of the Metroid games, like in Super Metroid, you really might get to a situation where you say, I'm going to go explore here. I think it's dangerous. I don't know if I really want to be doing this. And you kind of leave there knowing that, okay, I'll be able to go back to this specific point and it's centrally located. So, you go out there and things don't go the way you want, and you can basically just hit the load button and go right back to the save point that you chose. Mm-hmm. And then head out in a different direction.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, that this would obviously support that. So 2 other issues. One was and this one ties into sort of what you're talking about, the exploration, is I feel one of the things that the 2D Metroid games that I played did really well was once you sort of wrapped a section of the map or a chapter, they did a really good job of guiding you back to a point where you could go to the next thing, where you could take an ability that you had and now apply it. So I felt like, even though the maps could be fairly large, even just thinking of, I can't remember if it's Fusion or Zero Mission, but basically the way it's structured, it's almost a bit hub and spoke, right? So you go down an elevator into this area that has, it could be, plant-like, yep, or it could be ice-like.
And each spoke is locked off with a hard blockage, which you get the means to overcome it in another one of the spokes.
Exactly. And
so say, for example, you get a super jump in spoke A, which allows you to now access spokes, D and F. And in there is the tool that allows you to access spoke G. And it works really well.
It does work really well. And so I feel like what it allows you to do is maintain a mental map of the environment. So you might not know specifics, but when you get something, a light bulb goes off and you're like, aha, I can go there.
And to revisit an area you've already been, but to have new powers and to see a space that was challenging to you previously, exactly what was missing in Oblivion that so many people complained about because of the scaling enemy difficulty. And then so to suddenly go back in this area, and you really don't have to go that far through it because you don't need to traverse it in its entirety again, but just to go to the next branch on it that you couldn't overcome before. But then it's cool to be back in there, and really it's the clearest indicator for the total progress you've made so far with your character, when you just wipe out an entire room of dudes without even flinching.
Yeah, whereas in Shadow Complex, there's a line that appears on the map, and it's optional. You can turn it off, but that line, the default is to have that line on, and that line basically directs you to your next objective. And I wonder if that was something they'd had all the way through, or was it something they added to in response to things people were saying in playtests about that would have stemmed from the difficulty of maintaining a mental map in this game based on how their power-ups work. Because here, they're more, again, not super different, but they're color-coded. Like, there's certain obstacles certain doors that, can only be damaged or broken through with certain things. But because of how they're spread out, I found that it wasn't that easy to remember, oh yeah, so now I have that thing. So now I know these color codes. If something is coded this color, I can access that. But remembering where it was a challenge.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, is that part of the reason they had to introduce that? And then the last thing that sort of threw me off a bit was some of the power-ups are foregrounded in the apartment, sort of like, glowing icon style. But there are other things like ammo and I believe also health that are background objects. So they're in the environment. And when you pick them up, if you're not really watching the right point on the HUD, you might not realize that you picked something up. It's not like it sort of, pops into the foreground or does a little light show, or, I'm exaggerating here, but just something that really strongly communicates, yes, you picked this thing up.
I didn't have that problem because the only times you won't get the fanfare and sort of the meta UI intrusion is when it's just ammunition for weapons you already have or for health. Anytime it's something like a little more exotic than that, it will pause that. It goes into that weird, it grays everything out, makes you focus on the 2D element that it puts on the screen. About the navigation
I wouldn't have
stuff?
wanted it to be more pronounced than that. I like the grayed out, sort of grayscale effect for, major things. But it would have been nice to, even if it was just something, just thinking off the top of my head. But, when you open up a chest in God of War and, either magic or health flies at you, just something that just a little more strongly communicates, hey, I got this thing, while allowing you to continue doing what it is you're doing.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. As far as the navigation comments you had, like it just in general, it's interesting to me because it is so tricky. Less so in a 2D space like this than it is in a 3D space, just because like when you think of the real world, how do we map 3D spaces? We do it with 2D imagery, but a lot of games always want to go to the whole have this 3D vector map or something, and just that doesn't make sense to most people. It makes sense to programmers and people who think that way, and it just doesn't to anyone else. And so, in recent games like Prince of Persia and in Dead Space, of course, we have these optional waypoint, and of course all the Grand Theft Auto style games have implemented their own solutions, but they in Left 4 Dead, in Dead Space and Prince of Persia, they integrate it into the fiction of the world so it makes sense. And I think they've had great success with that. And I think the difference is that now there's such a wider variety of people that are playing these games that, look at the original Metroid. I think it would be entirely inscrutable to most people, just for the simple fact that they would never think to go left. They're used to that kind of game. They're like, okay, this is a two-dimensional game. I read left to right. I'm going to go left to right. And to even make them consider for a moment that they could go left from their point of origin, or that they can go down, or that they can go in the different directions, is unusual. And that's also part of where the fun comes from, right? It feels great when you follow out a hunch and you're like, I'm going to try to go the wrong way here. And it turns out that the wrong way leads you to a great bonus item or an Easter egg or something. But I think just defaulting the map aid that you're talking about is, if it came, maybe it came through playtesting, or maybe they just knew in advance. I think a lot of people, anyone making a game that has any degree of nonlinearity, you have to figure out from the get-go how you're going to get people through your world. I guess even if your game's entirely linear, like for the most part, the Half-Life 2 series, it's still about how do you get people to go forward in the right direction and find the way, look at the things you want them to look at.
Right, and they have to do a lot of things with, lighting and other things, because there are games that are pretty linear, yet if the level designers don't do a good enough job of leading your eye, and, you and Luke would know even more than I would, but it can be lighting, it can be sound, it can be enemies, it's so contradictory in some ways to human life, but Exactly, but like enemies in that direction, A, I got to kill them in that direction, and B, I probably should go in the direction they're coming from if it looks achievable. So there are all these things that can be done, yet there are still games today that don't do that well.
Is it like, do you put the biggest and most prominent piece of architecture off to the side, or do you put it exactly where you want people to? Do you use it basically as the breadcrumb trail for people to follow?
And what's the right degree of hand-holding?
Oh, I don't think there's ever... I mean, the right degree is always that the player is totally oblivious, goes exactly where they're supposed to go, but has no idea why they're going there other than they feel that they're following out their instinct, and then they feel rewarded for that. And that's going to be different. That's the problem. It's easier said than done because it works differently for every individual person interacting with the game. Some people, it will seem overly transparent. It would be like, I don't have to pull this magician's cloak off because it's already fallen off on its own. And other people still, you'll think, I'm sure Luke, at your studio, you've got, because you do such fine work with monitoring how people play, both, just on a personal level, but also, just through all the hard metrics and other data you get, that something will seem so self-evident, and yet 9 out of 10 people will sit there and be stymied by it to the point that they ultimately just give up the game.
Yeah, and there was that great story that my friend Clive Thompson did a long time ago on Halo and all the crazy metrics and stuff that we've had the benefit of using via Microsoft User Research. And I guess one of the things that comes to mind when you guys are talking about shadow complexes and then evolving this into a larger discussion is actually a particular anecdote from that piece talking about Sierra 117 in Halo 3, which is the first mission of the game. There was at one point in development this image that came back that indicated that players were actually backtracking inappropriately and walking around in crazy circles and getting caught in this scenario of just getting caught in this disastrous backtracking confusion. Why are there no enemies to fight? And the solution for that we ended up making was that once you crossed a certain point in the mission, you actually go to a drop down and you fall further and you can jump back up. And what that does is it's it's an elevation change that moves you to a new combat area, and it also makes it so that you now cannot confuse yourself. And I don't know if that's necessarily an elegant or inelegant way. I do know that it was an effective way, and subsequent playtests revealed exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, and that sort of blockage from programming from going back works really, really well obviously in a non-linear game, And I say that, I mean, there's no just linear or non-linear games, right? I don't want people to think that I'm saying that Halo is just, I mean, most games that even say that they're non-linear are basically just train tracks with really, really wide spacing between the rails. We're not talking necessarily about, like Ratchet and Clank where you're literally stuck on a rail and you're going through a world. You still have an enormous degree of flexibility tactically to go to the east or the west or to take a low road or a high road, but ultimately you don't have access to the entire world that's been streamed out, once you've jumped down from that cliff, that you're talking about or something like that.
Sure.
Well, before we move on to, this is a controversy, one thing I'm curious about how you guys feel is, would Shadow Complex have gotten as much attention if it had been sprites as opposed to, the gorgeous 3D artwork? Now, obviously, you can have gorgeous sprites, but I'm just sort of wondering, if this does well, is the message to developers who work in 2D gameplay styles, is the message to them that, hey, you guys have to step up to 3D, you guys need to license the Unreal Engine or something like it in order to be competitive, both critically and possibly even commercially? Because I think Metacritic-wise, I think Shadow Complex is, well, right now it's at 89. Earlier in the week it was 91. What do you guys think the message is to developers?
Well, Shadow Complex is a new IP, so I mean it's different. I certainly don't think that it's there's any kind of mandate that the next Metroid that's basically that has 2D gameplay would have to abandon sprites and adopt a proper 3D engine, graphics engine. But for if Shadow Complex was from the comparatively unknown studio, as opposed to Nintendo of Japan, and they were releasing this game and it was sprites and it wasn't like the most insane HD 2D animation you've seen, I think it would have suffered for it. From a gameplay perspective, of course, too, there is some 2.5D stuff going on. As you were talking about, you might shoot guys that are in the background or in the foreground, or you can take cover behind an object simply by moving left or right because you're being attacked from someone who's down a street that's at a 90-degree angle to the one that you're on. But yeah, I'll let you answer it, Luke.
I don't really have a good answer. I don't really. I mean, I don't really know. I guess I don't really understand what the question is as much as is this a? If anything, people. I think. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, is it maybe a different way of phrasing it? Is this going to lead to an escalation in the arms race for people who are making 2D perspective games for let's stick to the consoles? One thing that everyone's praised the game for are the graphics, and the gameplay's obviously gotten a ton of praise as well. But these guys have taken the power of the very successful, widely licensed Unreal Engine and applied it to 2D gameplay. We don't yet know what the sales are, and because it's DLC, we may never know precisely what the sales are. But certainly we're seeing a really strong critical response, and I'm wondering if this has now raised the bar for people who are making 2D perspective games to the point where now they're going to have to step up and compete on that arena with that level of graphics.
I think it probably depends. We'll see how successful Explosion Man is, for example, and that's a nice looking 2D game, but it's nowhere near as nice looking as Shadow Complex. And I don't think people feel, when you play that game, you don't feel as though, this is what I mean by it's case by case. When you play Explosion Man, you don't feel this game would be served so much better by higher fidelity graphics with more detail and more, I'm also curious, what about this? To what extent did Epic support the studio on this? Because I know it's in Epic's interest to prove that their engine's useful for a number of applications other than just, $60 three-dimensional games on 360 and PS3. And that's been something that they've wanted to promote for a while. So it seems like if they could use this as their marquee game and say, hey, let's support this, let's help them with the marketing and stuff, which, they have more experience with.
Well, they own Chair now, so for them, they've got many interests in seeing this do well, and obviously see it spread into other areas. Wasn't that game RoboBlitz for Xbox Live Arcade that also used Unreal? So there's at least one other game that used it. But at a certain point,
I think I don't know that
I would say they've reached a saturation point on shooters, whether 2D or 3D. I'm not 2D or 3D. I mean first person or third person. But my guess is that they would love to see more people who are making Xbox Live Arcade games use it. I'm curious to know, is there, will they start to have for on their rate sheet, if you're doing something for, that's 2D perspective as opposed to 3D perspective, do you get a lower rate than you would if you were doing, sort of a Gears clone? But I would agree with you that they're pretty interested in this doing well. Well, let's hit the thing that has been burning up the inner tubes over the past few days, which is the controversy about Shadow Complex, and which centers on Orson Scott Card's involvement with the game.
Right, and so Card, I put that out there because I have a couple of the quotes here. The issue stems around the fact that Card he runs a few blogs, and he's a very vocal opponent to homosexual marriage, and so The idea is basically that people are wondering that people that feel strongly in support of recognizing of legalizing gay marriage don't want to put money into the coffers of a vocal, opponent of what they're looking for. And so they proposed any number of things where they can ease their conscience and enjoy the game by donating some other amount of money, whatever they figure out would be equal to the royalties he would receive, to some organization that works the opposite way. But all the details aside, the thing, Card is just a crack up to me because he's, instead of just embracing his Mormon religion and saying, I believe that this is ethically wrong because my God says it's wrong, he attempts to perform the intellectual acrobatics that he thinks are necessary, kind of like you'd get with like a creation scientist, to have like the fair argument. So he said a number of things like, I'll start the quote here and I'll tell you when to end it. But there can be no serious question that homosexuality, to the degree that it cannot be overcome or outlasted, is a reproductive dysfunction. A human body that is evolved with functional organs of sexual reproduction is redirected to sexual activities that are reproductive dead ends. There you've got the classic argument that the sole purpose of a marriage then is to produce viable offspring, which then would suddenly mean that any woman who is postmenopausal, any man who's had a vasectomy or has, no dead sperm should seek divorce immediately, or be divorced by the state immediately because they're no longer, or I guess he could argue that since it's a reproduction. I mean, in this case, he's trying to use Darwinism on him, which makes no sense, because any Darwinist would just point back to him all the purposes for that sex provides for bonding issues and for other things. But and then his other quote was that the first and greatest threat from court decisions in California and Massachusetts giving legal recognition to gay marriage is that it marks the end of democracy in America. These judges are making new law without any democratic process. In fact, their decisions are striking down laws enacted by majority. This was funny too. Just in light of, I have to get my political thing out here. So he says he's complaining that already in several states there are textbooks for children that show that gay marriages are normal. And then he asks, how long do you think it will be before such textbooks become mandatory? Which is funny because right now in Texas, if you're following it, they're teaching, in some counties, they're teaching the history of conservatism in high school, as well as having mandatory biblical content, but they're not saying anything about the history of liberalism, which is totally classical, like the majority being... what's the famous quote is that the most lethal thing in the world is a majority that perceives itself to be a minority?
I haven't heard it, but that's a good quote.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, there we go. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. It's the end of the day, the guy doesn't believe that, and it's kind of odd that it gets involved with the game in the first place, but I understand though, if you are, you're absolutely for it and you realize you're giving money to someone who can end up using the money he gets to promote his agenda, it becomes an issue. But I don't think it's any more complicated than the decisions that people make day to day. I mean, like if you were really, really conservative and fundamentalist in some religion, you're used to doing this already in the opposite direction. You might say, well, we're not going to buy Tide because they advertise on this soap opera that has homosexual characters in it or something like that. It works both ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, so Christian Nutt wrote an opinion on this for Gama Sutra, and I guess part of what prompted the discussion was a thread on NeoGAF that was titled, should we boycott Shadow Complex? And which I read a fair bit of that thread, and on his in his opinion piece, he goes through the record of things that Orson Scott Card has said, his take on it, other people's takes on it, his meeting Donald Mustard of Chair, who actually had dinner with last week in LA, and what was interesting about the comments on that thread, the comments were as interesting as the article, is in the comments, Peter David started weighing in, and he said that
he made a GAF account?
No, No, not on GAF, on Gama
okay.
Sutra. And his take was, let's see if I can read a chunk of it. I believe it's not a complex, nice pun, in brackets. I believe it's not a complex question at all. I believe the answer to free speech is always more free speech. If you believe that Orson Scott Card is saying things that are wrong at the top of his lungs, then you say so at the top of yours. If he's donating money to organizations dedicated to infringing gay rights, you donate money to organizations that support them. A society that embraces free expression depends on an unimpeded exchange of ideas. The disconnect comes from those people who believe that boycotts are likewise a form of free expression. They're not. Boycotts are the opposite. They are designed to be punitive, to hurt someone financially. The message it says is, I dislike what you have to say, and therefore I'm going to strike back at you in order to punish you for saying it. It has nothing to do with attacking the things the person says. It's about attacking the person. Let me just read the next part, because I think it's kind of interesting. Extension on this. And he says, that is antithetical to the notion of a free society because it promotes a chilling effect. It's the equivalent of Archie Bunker growling, stifle yourself, because the message it sends is, if you say something I don't like, I'm going to find a way to hurt you. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins. Boycotts have nothing to do with free speech and everything to do with trying to give the other guy a financial bloody nose.
That's a really specific reference to boycotting there. I mean, I think it falls apart as soon as you compare any like historically important boycott with fucking Shadow Complex, you know?
Exactly. I mean, my whole thing is like, look, I don't agree with every boycott that's put out there, but I definitely support people's right to lead a boycott, even if it's in a matter that I don't believe, or should I say it's against, it might be against something I support, but I feel like boycotts are entirely legitimate.
It's just like, the other thing is, this is a product in a fucking capitalist society, you know? We're not talking about, I mean, and people exercise their right to buy or to not buy something, and they're putting it out there to make a profit, and no one would be stifling their ability to say something, only their ability to say something and retain the same profit that they hope to make by saying it the way they're saying it, which is, that's where it's muddy.
And there
right?
are people who came up with some potentially more elegant solutions if elegance is a value that people prize. And there's some people saying, it's like, look, some people saying, look, I don't want any of my money going to Orson Scott Card, and I don't want to let other people know in case they feel the same way. And if that's a boycott, it is a boycott, and I think that's entirely legitimate. Some people are like, look, well, I like these kinds of games. This game sounds good. I want to play it, but I also think his message is problematic, and I'm going to, if I pay $15 for the game, or 1,200 Microsoft points, I'm going to donate, I guess you can't really donate Microsoft points, so I'm going to donate $15 to an organization, a gay rights organization, or a pro-gay marriage organization, or something like that. And that's an interesting way of, of addressing it as well. But I think his idea, that this whole, likening a financial bloody nose to an actual bloody nose, I think is entirely silly. Now, he raises the point, he talks about Donald and his wife who work a chair. I've known Donald's wife for a really long time, and saying like, well, they're going to be hurt by this, and other people who had nothing to do with the stuff that Orson Scott Card said are going to be hurt by this, and that's a legitimate point to bring up. But the idea,
but then they chose to affiliate themselves with the person in the same way that, like, if you, if you had Glenn Beck do something for something that you did, and it ultimately had nothing to do with Glenn Beck's ideas. I mean, you ultimately chose that connection in the beginning, in the same way, like if when you accepted some of the places that politicians, when they get nervous about who they accept campaign donations from.
Exactly. And I think the thing is like, look, I mean, does it have a chilling effect? Sure, it might have a chilling effect. Absolutely. And are people trying to stifle Orson Scott Card's message? Absolutely, but again, in a free society, you have the right as to whether or not to buy or not buy something, and you certainly have the right to make other people aware of someone's involvement so that they can then decide whether or not they want to purchase something. There might be other boycotts. I mean, in this one, I definitely don't agree with the things that Orson Scott Card is saying at all. And I haven't decided for myself whether or not I think he has a sufficient level of involvement in this for me to be like, well, I'm not going to pay for it. But I think for other people who want to make his having any involvement at all a bright line, I would support that. In much the same way, there are other people who are popping up on there and saying, well, because there's this boycott or potential boycott, I'm not going to support. I'm going to actually support it. I'm going to go out of my way to buy it. Those are legitimate. Those are legitimate responses. I don't really get like some of the aspects of what Peter David is saying. I mean, the whole idea of this, unimpeded exchange of ideas, which it sounds like he's trying to create borders on how people express their criticism of what he's saying, and basically saying the only legitimate way to respond to it is by speaking up. The thing is that it's asymmetrical, right?
Yeah.
Some random poster on Gamasutra or on NeoGAF doesn't have the megaphone that someone like Orson Scott Card has. They just don't.
But even
and if they
with
want
that
to try
megaphone,
and create symmetry, say that?
I was going to say, though, like, even with, I don't know if my response is that it's just, like, greater apathy, but even with that megaphone, ultimately, I'm convinced that Card's irrelevant, and that's why I bought it with a clean conscience. That I don't think this is the kind of issue that, for one, just on the logistic level, I don't think enough gamers that would be interested in Shadow Complex in the first place are going to constitute a number great enough to make any difference here, but also because this is just an issue that I'm not saying it's just going to work itself out, but I don't think it's going to come down to, I don't know, I'm sort of thinking my position out loud here, and I'm already like, I'm debating. I know that you have big societal and generational changes, and they come about because there's a conglomerate of different forces that are all working together to change the zeitgeist or whatever. But I just think that things are moving that way. I mean, we already know. I mean, anytime you have polls, it's purely an age thing at this point, and that older generations are the most adamantly opposed to it, and more younger people, the way that they look at pot and other things, for example, just say, we don't understand. What the fuck does it matter? And increasingly see homosexuality as a genetic identity issue, and whether or not that's actually the case, it doesn't matter so much as it's just like asking someone to be what they're not, and then taking away their rights by telling them they can't do things that any other normal person can do. Because they're choosing to be, it's kind of like telling someone, why don't you bleach your skin and get the darkness out of you, or in past times. And thank God the perspectives are changing, and I guess personally, maybe this is the excuses I make for myself so I can say it doesn't matter, I want to play this game, it looks fucking fun and cool, and I want to support the guys that made it. But yeah, I just can't bring myself to think that Card matters much of anything.
Yeah, I think that you might, the demographics, at least as evidenced by polls, suggest that Orson Scott Card and people who think like him will eventually be revealed as an anachronism, that, perspectives are changing, and eventually, they'll, die off, and, these laws will get changed. But, I would caution that, history doesn't necessarily move in a straight line, and that, that it really does require, vigilance and sustained vigilance on the part of people who want to see certain changes occur in society to stick with it. It's like, I've been doing, just on my own time, more and more reading about the Reconstruction era in American history. And, just in the short version, just sort of seeing how the South, through persistent resistance, basically gradually overturned, the result of the Civil War, and one of the and basically reinscribed a number of aspects of slavery era law and codes and things like that that then took many decades to undo. So I guess it all depends on the scale of time over which you look at it.
This is true.
But certainly, the response to great change can be also some great reversals.
Yeah, this is true, and that's why I sort of started to flop around when I was articulating my perspective, is that I immediately thought of how, even from the framing of the Constitution, the idea that the slavery issue would just resolve itself, in order to keep the Union together. That was the idea with, and then again, up into the Civil Rights era, is the same thing. It happened in one place or another where people were just like, this will sort itself out. Happened the same with women, with women's rights. And so, yeah, I'm aware of that.
But I will say that the part that I think is sort of interesting in games is that there, is the aspect of people in the gaming community who, again, anytime something like this is brought up, or Resident Evil 5 or other games that people raise some sort of objection with, and their frustration comes from the fact that this is even being raised at all, right? That this is not
relevant. It seems like it's attention seeking.
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
kind of how I feel about it, is in a world where there are far more problems to be concerned with, the hours that people spend on the internet debating the merits of like this and like the merits of this discussion, like even having this conversation gives, I think, too much credence to the concern. Like it gives too much almost validity to this thing that like people need more stuff to do. Like they should be busier. Like go do something. Like the amount of like human energy expended on like the people who participated in that conversation, like all of that energy could have been so much like channeled so much better. Like it's a lot of kids, a lot of college kids who don't have a lot to do because school's not back in session yet, arguing, and like that's just, that's gaff, and that it spawned like this massive discussion and this whole like Gama Sutra thing, and Christian's an avid gaff reader, like all of that is just like, really?
Those people too, they weren't going to be doing anything more productive than their time. They were going to be on gaff having one discussion or another. So the matter was that the most interesting discussion they could be having at the time? You know what I mean? Like, it's not that they were not going to walk away from or close the gaff window on their browser and then go and do something that was probably going to be a much more productive toward gay rights or whatever.
Well, and actually even read the thread. Like I saw the thread pop up and was like, yeah, there's like, that just seems like people's feelings are going to get hurt, and a lot of people are going to get banned, and like there's like I'm going to go watch Alien.
Well, which is again also a legitimate response, but I don't think that's actually the worst thing. I don't think it's actually the worst thing for people to sort of say that, like, games, like any other medium, can raise issues that are political in nature, that are social in nature, that are other things, and it's legitimate to have those discussions. And there are other people who simply feel like, hey, the time I spend with games, just like the time I spend watching movies, is apolitical to me. I'm looking for entertainment. I don't want to discuss politics. I don't want to think about race. I don't want to think about gender. I don't want to think about sexuality. I don't want to think about any of those things. I just want to be entertained. And they're vocal about that in these threads, and they're very upset that these discussions are taking place. And
but this one, the difference though is that it's a step removed from that say the Resident Evil discussion wasn't. That was specifically about depictions of people in the game and the messages that the game itself might inadvertently or intentionally, it doesn't matter, might be, constructing. Whereas this is a matter of someone who's already, we had to sit there and sort through what this guy's involvement with the project was, and then it's about things that he's saying that don't pertain to the project, but ultimately the fact that you're giving money to who many people regard as an asshole. So it's just, I can see how people can hit that fatigue level that Luke's at much more readily with the Shadow Complex case than they could with Resident Evil 1.
Right, but I guess the thing is, like, when you think of the number of games, like, where these issues don't come up, so you sort of, like, wonder, well, like, where exactly is the fatigue coming from? Because to sort of hear some people, I mean, like, I don't know if we talked about this on Out of the Game, but when I made the comments I made on MTV Multiplayer, I was being interviewed, and I gave my reaction to the Resident Evil 5 trailer that was shown at E3 2007 because I was asked about it. After that, when the remarks were published, I made maybe 6 comments in the thread responding to it, and then after that, I mentioned it on 2 podcasts. Both of them were, I guess one was when it was called One Up Yours, and the other, I think, was maybe it had been renamed Listen Up, but 2 Ziff podcasts. And then the only time I ever wrote about it was my Edge column. I did, 2 Edge columns, a 2-parter, one sort of on my reaction to the reaction, and then the second part was on, the interview that I did with the producer of the game. And yet not everyone, let me back up, a number of people had it in their head that for 2 years, all I did was talk about
they're going to say the same thing imagery. About this too. You can't win that.
Exactly. And so, and that's what I was saying. And I realize this is not what you're saying. You're sort of, giving, you're sort of expressing this point of view, but this idea of fatigue setting in, and like, maybe they could say it's like, well, we're fatigued that these issues are being discussed in other parts of society, and now you're getting your social agenda into my games. But as far as games specifically, I don't see that these things are being discussed all the time or even constantly. But there is this perception that some people have. It's like, oh my God, there they go again. They're talking about this agenda, and they're bringing it to my games, and all I wanted to do was have fun. And I was like, really? Like, I mean, that really is getting in the way of the ability to enjoy this game? I mean,
by fatigue, I meant a case-by-case situation where it wasn't with the larger issue, but it was specifically about the conversation that we're having about as it pertains to Shadow Complex and Orson Scott Card. But you're right. I mean, I think there are always going to be people, and because you can't conclusively prove them wrong, who suspect that there's a number of people who are commenting and writing about the industry, and that it's always going to be tempting to try to carve out one's own niche. Pardon me. That they would say, well, this is the path that they're taking. They want to be the one who brings sort of a political conscience to discussions about gaming. That's a difficult charge to defend against. I mean, because you've been defending against it for 2 years now. It's just kind of like, I mean, I assume in the same way that you have, your response is to acknowledge that there are going to be people that think that, and to continue doing what you're doing in hopes that at some point you're able to convince someone to think differently, or to show that there is merit. Like, even in this case, like, we would have to argue to Luke, that there's a point to all this.
Right. Well, and I think one thing that some people feel, and some people expressed, definitely in the GAF thread, I feel like they feel the subtext of those people who are calling for a boycott is that if you don't support the boycott, or you decide to buy the game instead, that you're somehow a bad person for having decided to buy the game. And I felt the people, at least on GAF, who were advocating a boycott or explaining why they chose not to spend their own money in the game, were trying to keep that separate from casting aspersions on those people who decided to go ahead and buy it. And it brought up even interesting issues beyond Shadow Complex. I mean, apparently the composer for the music composer for the Dragon Quest games whose name I don't have in front of me, is a Japanese nationalist who denies that the rape of Nanking in China took place.
Wait, who is this?
And apparently,
what's he? He's at Square.
This is a NX before Square.
Okay.
So I don't know if he's on staff or just the guy who they bring in to compose the music. But he's a denier, and apparently he signed his name to a letter that ran in a newspaper in the United States that was denying that this took place, right? And so, is that a valid enough reason? Is that someone who is crucial enough to that game for people who are Dragon Quest fans or who might purchase it to say like, well, I don't want to purchase that game, and I mean, look, I get the discomfort that this stuff can raise. It is nice, sometimes ignorance, and I say ignorance as in not knowing, is bliss, where you can just, walk up to the movie theater, walk into a GameStop and, just enjoy whatever it is there to be enjoyed and not have to think about these things. But I mean, life is complicated, and sometimes, parts of your life that have been very simple for a while, have the potential to be complicated. And I mean, to me, I think it's only ultimately a good thing that gamers have discussions around topics like these.
You should know that I think the people that are going to be uncomfortable with that are probably going to feel that way regardless of the format. I think probably if we watch the news closely this week and next, we'll start to see some of the, some parallels between, maybe not so much with the card case, but just cultural criticism being applied to a work of pop art with Inglourious Bastards, where Tarantino is going to be saying this is just a fun movie, right? Who gives a shit what happens to Nazis? And then and American Jews who are used to the idea that yes, I mean, it seems like this great and totally fun revenge fantasy where instead of all the introspective and the hand wringing that goes on in a typical Holocaust movie, or surrounding the release of a Holocaust movie, you're going to have just, hey, let's just enjoy it. This is basically the exterminated turn the tide and fuck up the Nazis. But then when it's when we start to look at Israeli reaction, for example, where in an Israeli Jew's mind, there's going to be the Palestinian situation and the IDF and compulsory military service and basically a people that is no longer in that powerless situation, and it's going to maybe see like a lot different movie where they're instead of instead of thinking about the Third Reich and the Holocaust day to day, they're probably thinking about what's happening with their most immediate neighbors, and the movie's going to be read differently that way. And I'm sure you'll see a whole bunch of discussion about it. And there will be a ton of people who say, I just don't give a shit. I want to see these fucking Nazis get swastikas carved into their heads before they're burned to death. And then there are going to be people that say, well, let's think about it.
It's a really good point. And I know that I have a number of friends who are historians, and one of the things they caution about, clearly Inglourious Bastards is more of a historical fantasia. As far as we know, there was not a movie theater premiere in Paris where all these Nazis shown up and, bad things happened to them. But what they caution is the danger of, stories that focus on the exceptional, because what they feel is that what they sort of subconsciously do is create this perspective. It's like, well, why didn't everyone fight back? Right? Like, sort of like, well, what was, the projection is, it's like, well, I would have been, one of the bastards, I wouldn't have been the guy that got caught behind enemy lines. I wouldn't have been the person that got marched off to a camp, and those kinds of things. The more you study about history, clearly, the more complicated those things are. And, for someone like me having an interest in, in slavery and post-slavery and, those kinds of things, one of the things I'm very interested in is how did people live under those circumstances? How do people live under oppressive circumstances? Because so often when you see it portrayed in popular culture, maybe you see some slaves in the field, maybe you see the overseer whipping someone, those kinds of things, but you quotidian life you don't really get a sense of. So when you start reading these books and start reading these accounts, and you start to see things that the reason they don't make sense to us is because we simply weren't taught. So the idea that there were black overseers on certain plantations, or that a black slave would be trusted to take crops to market and sell them on behalf of his or her master and then come back, that's kind of shattering for anyone who hasn't studied it, because you haven't even really been given the tools to fully understand the parameters of how an institution like slavery functioned on a day-to-day basis. So to bring it back to Inglourious Bastards, I think, look, I'm not saying that the audience is stupid. Hopefully most of them will understand that it is a historical fantasia. But what is the subtext of what they're going to take away? It's like, well, the focus on these cool people that resisted in this way. As resistance takes many forms, it's not always as cool as breaking out a Louisville Slugger and taking it to a Nazi's head. And I think that kind of conversation is something that you're likelier to have in a more visible way in Israel surrounding that movie than you're likely to have in the United States.
Right.
I think in the United States it's going to be sort of off to the side, among like a handful of, alternative press, and, maybe you'll see a Sunday New York Times piece here or there, but I can't imagine it's going to be a super prominent discussion.
I wouldn't think so. It would probably be the more prominent discussion here would probably be about, like, with movies like Defiance, and kind of the same situation where you were talking about, where you see exceptions, and so some people are going to read that movie as apologetic and say that, like, oh, well, everyone was trying to assassinate Hitler, or they're actually only telling a partial truth there, and the reason for that motivated the assassination was only when the country was clearly going to lose the war and go down the fucking tubes, along with its entire dreams for a 1,000-year Reich. But I say we've been taping for a long time, and to take it to some lighter territory, I'd take any proposals, but
break it down.
I did want to recommend Killing Floor, which is a PC game by Tripwire Interactive. They're the guys who made Red Orchestra. They were originally mod makers, and they won the Make Something Unreal contest that allowed them to sell a retail game using Unreal Engine 2.5, I think. And so they made this interesting game, and it came out shortly after Left 4 Dead, and it was really bad timing for them because it's another cooperative anti-zombie game. I ended up not getting it because I heard so many people dogging on it, and I think it was just because the proximity was just too close to people playing Left 4 Dead and then World at War zombie mode. All they would comment on, I mean, I never got any really specific stuff about, like, about the systems and that the design were bad. It was just that it was cheesy, and I understand that because when I finally bought it last night and you open it up, it looks like a mod in some ways. The presentation level is very mod-like, and the art direction for the creatures is really old school, early id type stuff where, you have a guy with a gun for an arm, and he's pretty fucking corny, man. I'm just gonna be honest. So when we actually start playing the game, and it was just Rory and I at first were playing it, and we had a couple other people in Vent with us, and they were kind of curious. They were like, "All right, tell us how it is, and we'll buy it." And soon enough, we were just like having so much fun and screaming and yelling and shit that, like, we just started seeing the people in the Vent server with us, because we couldn't even hear them at that point. We were just like having fun playing the game. I mean, part of it is making fun of some of the stuff, because, like, the voice acting is horrible. There's the arms trader, and I'll explain how the game works in a second, but the arms trader is like this a black British woman who every time, I don't know, like, everything she says is some crazy sexual innuendo. And it's just completely fucking absurd, and you can't, like, laugh at how, like, ridiculous it is, and thinking that they didn't, whoever conceived it didn't imagine it was going to play off the way it's playing. But anyway, and everyone ended up buying the game. We were playing it and we loved it. And it's kind of like Very simple. You kill waves of zombies. You move across these very, very large maps that are largely nonlinear. The pacing is somewhere between Left 4 Dead and Resident Evil, and I find that I like that, where since it's slower, you're really focusing on getting the headshots, and then the more skill shots you get Z time, yet another iteration of bullet time, but it applies for everyone on the team. And of course, that allows you to start chaining things because you're able to line up even more headshots and get stuff like that. And they have a wide range, almost too many classes of AI zombies, where Left 4 Dead has very few, and each one plays a very specific role that complements one another in a way that, I can just imagine their whiteboard, how it eventually ended up, where they could say, this is exactly what this guy does. He's created for this purpose. Whereas in Killing Floor, it's a little more wild and woolly. You could see someone just was like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had a guy that is partially invisible until he strikes, and then you have a commando class that's better able to see him, and we'll throw him in here with all these other guys. But it's fun for $17. It's definitely enjoyable, and the way it works is that you defeat the wave, and then the traitor will appear in a new location. But you'll have some indication where the traitor is going to appear before you clear the wave, and so the challenge becomes. Are you going to get stuck somewhere in an Alamo situation and successfully fight the wave off, but then be so far that when you've cleared it, you can't get to the traitor in time before the next wave comes, and then she closes her shutters again, and leaving you without more advanced weapons and ammo and other upgrades. A lot of really cool weapons too, which makes it fun. Everything from chainsaws to katanas and crossbows and flamethrowers. And this is the designer side I think is interesting, is that for the crossbow, the scope, when you zoom in, it only occupies the center of your screen, so you still have some peripheral view, which is kind of cool because, normally one of the trade-offs with a scoped weapon is that you lose the peripheral vision for the precision. And here, you don't have perfect precision, and you still have that, but then they introduce the trade-off by having really high latency, so it takes a fucking long time to reload this thing. It's a cool effect, and it's fun. And there's a number of little things like that where it's like you can pick it apart and appreciate this and that, and then laugh at the stuff that's hokey. But just as far as a fledgling team and saying, hey, they had this idea, they delivered on it in really short order, and they made a fun game out of it. I think it's cool. I can't imagine anyone playing it with a group of friends and not having a great time.
Wow. Is it a Source engine or different tech?
They're using Unreal again because of the license that they won. So that's the other thing. As far as I can tell, right. It's probably also 2.5. And so it'll look, it looks dated. But there's great animation and stuff. You have the hit-based stuff. You blow dudes' heads off, and some of them keep coming at you depending on the type of AI they are. After a while, you have the boss encounters, and there's another interesting mechanic they have is with welding doors, where you can close a door and then you can weld it up to a certain percent, and you can start to seal, put yourself in a short-term tactical disadvantage, meaning that you have your back exposed while you're sealing one door, and there's always going to be other entrances for the long-term strategic advantage that you change the map basically. And that's fun. There's big, and then there's big outdoor areas as well. I kind of like, there's something about all these zombie games. I don't think, when people have the debate over which is the best co-op zombie game out now, it's like I'm not the one to declare any winners because I think they each do something well. Like what I like about World at War is just the way that it allows people to ramp up the difficulty at a pace that's largely of their choosing. You get enough points and you say, let's open another door. We're going to gain access to better weapons and then utilities, but then we're going to have more enemies coming at us in greater numbers and from more entry points, But it's kind of cool to play them all and just to see what the perfect game would be from the next generation could come out of the lessons learned from them all.
How did you like the welding mechanic?
It's fun. I mean, it's fun to grief people with it too. I'd be lying if I didn't say that. Like we were running in a big posse. I don't know what the total cap is on players, but we had like 8 people in, and it nicely scales in difficulty based on how many people are in the game. But we would run forward, and then we would stand in the doorway and block access to the arms trader to the people we didn't like because there's collision volume around the player model. and then we would weld them inside someplace that was shitty, and they would have to, you can unweld it, but then while they're sitting there doing that, or they would be new and they didn't understand how that worked, we'd run off. But playing, as for using the welding mechanic the way it's supposed to be played, I enjoy it. I think it's a good idea. It's kind of a more naturally integrated method of boarding up the windows in World at War, where there you just go and you press the contextual button, and that's for usability. You just go up there and press a button, and then boards sort of telekinetically place themselves over the window, whereas here you actually have to pull out your welder and then use it on the object.
Wow, it sounds cool. I mean, it seems like there's also now this, not now, but you've definitely over the last 24 months or so seen this ramp in zombie games. Burn Zombie Burn came out for PlayStation Network. There's Zombie Apocalypse, which is coming out for Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. And Housemarque, which did Super Stardust HD, which is a fairly acclaimed twin-stick shooter on PSN that Sony published. They've got a zombie game, also looks like top-down twin stick coming out for PSN. So and then you've got Killing Floor, you've got Left 4 Dead, you've got RE5 just came out early this year, and these other things. And obviously it's understandable, the popularity of zombies, in addition to the archetypal popularity. They work really well for games because you can have humanoid enemies, but they sort of have the properties of robots and other things, in the sense that they're you can just have waves of them and take them out and not feel too bad about it, because they're zombies. And
that's the other trend there. There's two trends that you're talking about. One is specifically having zombies and zombie fiction in your game, and then the other is this sort of defend or survive as long as you can, even though you're not necessarily fighting zombies. So this would then grow to encompass horde mode in Gears of War 2. I'm curious what they're
coming soon.
And so that's increasingly popular for co-op, but it's interesting to me, the idea that, especially when there's in some of the games where there's situations that you can't necessarily win, like in World at War or in Killing Floor, I'm kind of curious to see how people respond to that over time, if they like that. They like just that it. I mean,
well, do you think that's a message about the futility of war?
If it is, I'd say it's inadvertent, because I think it's more toward going back to just that's how so many games worked from the advent of games that had objectives to them other than beating an opponent. Early arcade games and stuff. If Will Wright makes one, he'll tell us that that's what he had in mind.
Well, one thing I like about co-op is, in the co-op, the way it's done in these games, is that I feel that Halo helped push this really big time on consoles, as did a bunch of other games that came in its wake. But multiplayer, so it's you competing against other human beings, real life people. And part of what got lost a bit in the shuffle is the fun that can be had when you're going up against AI. Now, obviously, in campaign, you do that, but there's, I felt like in the industry there was very much this philosophy that was, coming as almost like, well, single player is training for multiplayer, or campaign is training for multiplayer, or multiplayer and then massively multiplayer is the future, and single player is an aberration. And while the co-op is not single player, I feel like what Valve did with Left 4 Dead, what you had with Horde in Gears of War 2 from Epic, what you saw some of the way they did co-op in Resistance 2, and Firefight is the joy that can come, and it doesn't take anything away from competing against other people. There's a certain fun there that can't be reproduced, but going up against waves of AI when it's just you and your buddies trying to stay alive and take on the computer controlled enemy. There's something about that, and the way in which that play can be directed towards giving you and your friends a certain kind of shared experience, I feel is really powerful. And I'm glad to see developers tap into that, even if a number of them are choosing a zombie fiction in which to do so. I think there's a lot of potential there around replayable co-op. And I think with the growing popularity of, you sort of the roadblock I call that, when you look at the, Major Nelson's top 10 live activity charts and you see the same games, Halo 3, Call of Duty 4, Call of Duty World at War, GTA 4, and Left 4 Dead occupying, the 6 of the top 10 spots. I think other developers are going to have to start looking at other ways to break in with multiplayer. And so I think there's a lot of potential there, and I'm curious to see what other developers do.
Luke, you got any thoughts on that, if you're still with us? Luke went, he didn't message us, but my sixth sense knows that he had a bout of diarrhea. He had to run to the bathroom.
Wow.
Yeah, the other thing, I think you pretty much covered all with that type of game. I mean, you do avoid having to, by not having an end scenario and not having so much of a specific story, it just lends itself to the replayability. It's kind of like, I think, looking at how people play competitive games, and because it's a known fact that they're nearly infinitely replayable, and bringing that over to cooperative. And if it's too specific and it's too, kind of like, in Splinter Cell, Bravely put the co-op mode for Chaos Theory in, and it was enormous fun, but I think most people only played it once because it was designed like single-player content, and the scenario was going to become totally familiar, and the only thing that was going to change is the specific tactics that you employed, or if you tried to do a few different new things. I would like to see if we can find something where, outside of like an MMO or something, where you're just having to create a shitload of content, where you get that replayability, but it's not just here's a bunch of dudes spawning and kill as many as you can and stay alive as long as you can until the next wave.
Well, I feel like we're going to see that. I mean, you look at objectives, progression. In Horde, it's on a single map. And what most people do is probably pick a nicely defendable point and hold up there. With Left 4 Dead, you have to ultimately get from safe room to safe room, and then ultimately, get ferried out or choplifted out or whatever. And I feel that there's, again, I keep saying there's a lot of potential in that, and I think as more people play these games, as you just sort of get more user feedback and those kinds of things, I think developers will continue to plunge deeper along that path. And, whether it's a new genre or subgenre, I don't know for sure, but I feel that, one of the things that's, a rich area to be explored is this kind of co-op and highly replayable co-op. I mean, look at what Infinity Ward is planning to do with Modern Warfare 2 and the Special Forces mission, where they said, hey, we don't think co-op works in our campaign, so we're going to create separate missions that are specifically for co-op.
How are they doing those too? Like, I haven't been following that as much as I should. I'm kind of like looking forward to being surprised, but are there co-op missions designed to be, infinitely replayable like what we're talking about, where we have waves of guys spawning, or are they very specific missions like you'd find in a single-player campaign, albeit designed for multiple people to be working together?
I don't know yet. I'm not sure if they've either shown it to media or whether media's been allowed to talk about it yet, but I feel like that Special Forces is still being kept relatively close to the vest. I mean, they didn't really talk about multiplayer at E3. It's only, in the last month or so
Gamescom
that they've started to release details about multiplayer. So customizable kill streaks, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And, just kind of shows that, they continue to be a studio at the top of their game, which is always exciting.
So, Luke, have you returned from Shard Threat Alpha? I think he hasn't. So I was saying that now. I think we should wrap it up. But since we lost someone, this is the first time we've had someone actually enter Shard Threat Alpha during a taping, and we're gonna have to figure out.
I guess that leaves you and I as the 10-speed and brown shoe, or
he's just gonna have to hit
of podcasting.
Stop on his recording whenever we're done. I want you to think about that. Our audience, if you made it all the way, you outlasted one of the members of the podcast. So
excellent. Well, as the nominal host, I will say, Sean, thanks for sticking it out the entire show and not leaving me to Spalding Gray my way to a conclusion.
you as well.
And, tune in again in 2 weeks' time when hopefully we have a full complement of our fellow podcasters, and maybe even we'll convince Luke to stay on for the entire show.
Yeah, well, we're going to send him some Kaopectate before we tape. That's the only solution to it. So,
a very good idea. All right, and with that, we are out.